Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone's had a good 50th anniversary of Earth Day today. So we just want to say good evening and welcome to our first online webinar for our Green Living Workshop series here at the town of Okotoks. So over the next couple of months, we will be hosting our workshops online. So thanks so much for joining us today on our new format. I think we're maxed out at 100 participants today, so I hope everyone was able to make it out. If you've attended a Green Living workshop before, you will remember that we have always had a door prize. So going online hasn't changed that at all. All attendees will be able to be entered to win a seed starter kit. So please watch your email tomorrow and you'll see if you're the winner. So it should be interesting. We'll try and drop it off for you in a very safe and germ-free way. So our presenter today is Colin Russell. He's a fellow Okotokian and has been growing his own veggies for over 40 years. Now, before being in Okotoks, he lived in Fort McMurray, so he knows a lot about tough gardening conditions. Colin is an active member of the Okotoks Garden Club, and he may or may not be married to the president of the garden club. So today we have, if you look at the bottom of your screen, we have a Q&A option at the bottom of the webinar window there. So to keep within our time frame, Colin's going to answer one question from our Q&A box after each slide. So if you could please type in your questions at any time in the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer what questions we can within our allotted time. Also, if someone asks something that you would like to know about, you see a question there and you like that question, you want to get on board with that question, click on the thumbs up on the question and it will move that question up in the queue. So I will know that that question's got a lot of interest. So if we don't get to all the questions this evening, we will email you a response to your question over the next couple of weeks. So it's just Colin and I, mostly Colin, answering these questions. So you got to give us a little time there. Alternatively, if you come up with a question after the presentation, please feel free to email any questions that didn't get answered to sustainability@okotoks.ca. So now before we begin, I want to do a quick poll to see how many people out there have grown veggies before. And if so, for how many seasons have you been growing veggies? So how many years? So the poll will pop up on your device. So choose an answer and we'll get some good stats here on our veggie gardeners. Ooh, good job, guys. This is fast. Okay, our votes are in. Okay, Colin, here we go. So we have 23%, which is 11 people, who are new to this. We have 44% who have been doing it for 1 to 5 years, 25% who have been doing it for 5 to 10 years, and 8% that have been doing it for almost as long as you. So we've got a big variety of people here. I think that's wonderful. Okay. So I'm going to pass the rest of the workshop over to Colin now. So Colin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you and welcome. I should just add to Ginny's comments that we hope to make the slide presentation available. I'm not sure how we'll get that out to everybody, but we'll make a PDF copy of it and provide it available after the presentation. So you don't have to go scribbling notes completely through every slide. So it is quite a busy presentation. We've got a few slides to go through here, and I certainly encourage you to ask as many questions as you can, and we'll certainly try to answer them tonight. So the presentation, I'm just going to move on here to one slide. This is sort of an agenda for the tonight's presentation. The presentation's intent is an overview of the essential aspects of vegetable gardening. It's an introduction only to inform, encourage, and hopefully inspire you into the immensely satisfying and rewarding activity of vegetable gardening. And I should say, I hope that although you'll hear my English accent, I hope that doesn't put you off. As Ginny said, most of my vegetable gardening is in the challenging climates of Fort McMurray, and for the last 5 or so years in just as challenging a climate here in Okotoks, but just in a different way. So it is an introduction, as I mentioned, and many of the topics that I cover could be subjects in their own right, and I could consume the entire presentation on just 1 or 2 of them easily. So raised garden beds, container gardening, composting, growing tomatoes or potatoes. I'm sure there'll be an interest in that. So forgive me if I omit some detail, I'm sure I will, but the intent of tonight is to inform you and for you then to be able to adapt and apply to your own specific situations. So these are the basic topics I'll be covering. If you think there's anything that I've omitted specifically, then please let Ginny know. Any questions?
Okay, I'll jump in here. We did have one question about growing veggies that are deer resistant, or about how the best way to keep deer away.
Oh, shucks. So the best way to keep deer away, unfortunately, is a high fence. So at the community gardens, at the Okotoks Farmers Market, there are 6-foot fences, and I don't think there's anything that would stop deer. There's no such thing as a deer-resistant vegetable. I hate to say that. Even deer-resistant plants are only minimally effective. Sorry, I couldn't be any help. I wish I knew an answer. Okay. All right, first steps. So it's planning a vegetable garden. And obviously the first, if you haven't started before, then you need to talk about and decide what's the size that you're going to grow in terms of the plot size. My initial advice would be simply, if you haven't gardened before, start off small, be successful, and then grow as you decide that you like the activity. I would just caution you about jumping in with too large a plot to start off with. I mean, the one on the right in the picture there is probably a good size. It's probably 12 feet by 25 feet or something or more. And you don't want to overwhelm yourself, or don't want to find this ends up becoming a chore rather than something that you're enjoying. And think of the end in mind as well. If all of your vegetables are going to come due in September, then you've got to think about storage, and that might feel like work for you as well. So secondly, as you're deciding what it is you want to grow. So what do you like to eat? And I like to just mention a very quick anecdote. A couple of years ago, when I was at my community garden, there was a young 6-year-old boy with his father planting his garden for the first time. And we asked him, what is he growing? What does he like to eat? And the little boy knew instantaneously what he wanted to grow. And while we smiled at his answer, which was French fries, and we educated him and said, well, okay, so you need to grow potatoes, obviously. But he knew exactly what he wanted and why he wanted it. And there's no point in growing a whole ton of beets and cabbages or broccoli, or for, I don't know whoever eats kale out there, but there's no point in growing it if nobody in the family eats it at all. It sounds like an obvious question, but you'll be surprised. So some other factors just to think about, especially if you've got limited growing space, is what are some of the vegetables that are difficult to find in grocery stores? Is it easy to find things like golden beets or golden zucchini, purple carrots or purple potatoes, lime, lemon, and Thai basil, or apple, ginger, or chocolate mint. There's a whole bunch of varieties of vegetables out there that it's not that easy unless maybe you're going to a farmer's market somewhere that you might find them. What's expensive to buy? So there's a whole bunch of items if you go in the stores, even in the summertime, such as Swiss chard, asparagus, celeriac, and fennel, that's far more expensive and very easy to grow in many cases. For improved taste and nutrition, grown without pesticides, and you know that because you've grown them, and from eating, with the benefits of eating fresh organic vegetables. So there's a ton of vegetables that fit into that category. So peas, as I've just put up there, tomatoes, lettuce, Swiss chard, beans, and carrots all benefit from eating fresh, straight from the garden and putting on your plate. And so, think about those and plan what it is you want to grow. Any questions?
No questions yet.
Okay, good. All right. So planting your garden, first and foremost, is sunlight. So you need a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight for vegetables to thrive. So does that mean that you can grow, if you only get 4 hours, that you can't grow anything? No, it doesn't. So something like 4 hours would be considered partial shade. Less than 4 hours, you're starting to look at full shade requirements almost. So if you're in a partial shade situation and you don't have the luxury of being able to get 6 hours, you can still grow things like spinach and carrots and beets, arugula. There's a lot of the leafy green vegetables that will still grow. They will take longer. And so it's prime importance of, if you're less than certainly if you're around 4 hours or less, you want the varieties with the shortest days to maturity to benefit from those conditions. Consider raised beds. You'll see in a few of my photographs, I've tried to cover quite a number of raised beds. Raised beds improves accessibility to your garden, even for people that may be wheelchair bound. You will certainly see some, here's a community garden that somebody could actually garden with in a wheelchair, or you may be restricted with back problems, and so you're not so much on your hands and knees as you are as frequently on a regular garden. And certainly raised gardens can be any height. So give that some thought as well into your planning. If you're into, as I do, I have a community garden by the Okotoks Farmers Market. Before you start planting, inquire about any rules that they may have. I know a couple of community garden rules restrict the height of vegetables. They don't want you growing things like corn or even peas or beans that will shade a next door neighbor or a next door community garden next to you. And also, you may not be able to leave perennial type plants in your vegetable garden. You may be required to clean out your vegetable garden at the end of each season. So things like asparagus and artichokes and chives and mint, or even raspberries or strawberries or rhubarb, all benefit from growing and staying there year after year. And you may end up with some restrictions in community gardens. Give some thought to what you're planting if you're going to be away on vacation. There's no point in putting a whole bunch of time and effort into planting peas or beans that are going to come due at the early August. and you're going to be away for the first 2 to 3 weeks of August. You want to be there at the time when those things ripen, and they are 10 times better eating fresh than eating after they've passed maturity. Questions?
Okay, we do have a few questions. So Lynn was asking, if you use a raised bed, do you need to follow the recommended row plant spacing on the packages, or can you plant closer together?
So you can plant closer together. And I will cover a little bit of square foot gardening later on. The square foot gardening was an interest in, I'm going to say, about 1981, when there was an engineer who focused on efficiencies in his own workplace. So came up with a theory about maximizing your production from a small garden space. And you'll see in some pictures later on, I think I show some square foot gardening. So if you're in a raised bed, you don't have to plant in rows at all. You can scatter seed to maximize your production in that area. You still sort of need to give some thought to spacing. If you're growing cabbages, they need quite a bit of room. If you're growing potatoes, they still need a lot of room. My only suggestion was there were some errors in square foot gardening when it first came out, and I think he subsequently corrected those. You can't just put a 6-foot 6-inch raised bed on top of grass. It needs to be, as deep as if you're growing carrots, and the carrots are going to be 6 or 7 inches long. You need to have space for those roots to go beyond that. So just give some thought to it. But you can certainly, I wouldn't say ignore the rules that are on the back of the packets, but you can certainly put them a little bit closer together. And there's a big advantage if you can get around on a raised bed on both sides. You don't need any rooms, any aisleways for access. I hope that answers your question. I just quickly put up this one slide on beans and peas, just to show people you can, scarlet runner beans in the middle here get very thick and quite heavy. They need a fairly robust support system. As you can see on both sides, one's on the right-hand side here, somebody's gone to quite a lot of effort with bamboo canes. On the left-hand side, somebody's making more rustic looking out of old twigs and branches, which either will certainly work, but you just need to think about they're going to cause some shade on your property and give that some consideration. If you're growing peas, you want some netting behind them so that the plants themselves can wrap them around and get some support from the netting. Any questions?
Yeah, we've got a few here.
Okay.
Okay, so regarding planning, Leslie is asking, in a raised garden bed, oh, where did my question go, Leslie? Someone liked it. Okay, it went up to the top. Should I line the bed with black landscape paper, and what is the ideal soil to compost ratio?
So ideally, you can do it depends on the soil. If your soil is a rich loam soil, it certainly wouldn't hurt if you were 50-50 compost and soil mix. If like a lot of places around here, you're dealing with clay, the more compost you'll add, you will certainly break up your soil into a much easier medium. But the most compost you can put in, the more compost you can put in, the better it will be. And that compost will break down and you won't need to really add any fertilizer at all. With regards to the black lining, I generally, on a raised bed, wouldn't put any black line material in it. I wouldn't think there's any need, especially if it's a relatively deep bed, if it was 10, 12 inches. What you might want to think about on a raised bed is there are some self-watering techniques that you can employ. They are quite complicated, and you might want to then put a liner in, but they can become self-watering. It's a topic unto itself, and that I don't cover tonight in a lot of detail.
Okay, and I'm just going to jump in here quick,
Sure.
Colin. We do have a lot of questions, so I apologize to everybody if we don't get to your questions tonight. But we are going to try and stick to one question per slide. So don't worry, we will get back to you about your questions so that they are answered for you in the future.
Absolutely, and if we have time at the end, I'll certainly come back to them. I've just put up a quick slide here on basic tools, simply because of people being new to this. If you're been gardening for 4 and 5, and as long as I have, this is just old hat to you, so forgive me. But I just thought I'd mention, look, the essentials you need out there is a spade, a fork, a trowel. It's nice if you've got a bypass pruner out there for cutting off plants and vegetables. You can get away with a pair of scissors or even a knife, unless you're getting into sort of thinning out raspberry canes or something like that. The others are nice to haves. They're certainly helpful if you're getting into hoeing and weeding. The little brown knife on the bottom right that's laid flat is my favorite weeding knife. I've had it for God knows how long. And the other thing I'd mention, the blue mat below is a kneeling pad. If you're on your hands and knees as much as I am, getting yourself a half decent kneeling pad. This one here came from a Dollarama store, and it's just perfect. I've got to be honest, it's great. I use light work gloves most of the time, and I use my watering can almost every day in the summertime, but not for my vegetable gardens. It's for my rest of my garden. And the primary purpose of a watering can for me is so I know how much fertilizer I'm mixing in the right quantities. The rest of the time I'm using a hose to water my vegetable gardens. So it's a relatively quick slide. If there's any questions, just shout out.
So one quick question, what's your favorite fertilizer?
Oh, my favorite fertilizer absolutely is dead easy. It's 20-20-20 soluble. And I think it's, I don't mess around. It's just a good general fertilizer, but that's my soluble one. And then usually it depends what I feel like, but I might put a granular fertilizer on at the beginning of the year. And usually the granular fertilizers are usually something like 7, 10, 8 or something like this. I'll go into a little bit of fertilizers a little bit later on. But granular fertilizers are good if you've got poor soil conditions, you don't have a lot of compost, and granular breaks down slowly. So I tend to add, I grow a lot of roses as well, and I add a lot of granular fertilizer at the beginning of the year to my roses, but occasionally I'll do it with my vegetables too.
Can we do one more quick question? We've got 3 people wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Okay, so Todd is asking, can you speak to seeding intervals for staggered harvest of similar species? So if I want carrots throughout the summer, can I seed the first batch and allow it with a second batch a couple of weeks later? And does this apply to other veggies as well?
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, Todd. I will talk about it just briefly later, but you can certainly have multiple seedings. In fact, I'd say if you're growing things like lettuce, spinach, arugula, a lot of those leafy vegetables, I would say if you seed every 2 weeks, for the first 6 weeks or maybe even more. It's generally how I go about my seeding. Carrots, not so much. I tend to seed most of my carrots all together, and I do my beets as well. And I simply pick them younger, and the ones I leave just end up going into full maturity, and I leave them, probably the most of the harvesting at the end of August or something. But where you can, absolutely, things like tomatoes, we just don't have a long enough season. So there's really no opportunity. But certainly with the leafy vegetables, the quick to maturity vegetables, absolutely go on. And as I said, for lettuce, every 2 weeks easily. Was there another one?
There's a few more, but you just keep trucking along. We can get them later.
All right. And I would say, as you can see here, one good piece of advice is always clean your tools at the end of the season. If only I did. Okay, garden prep. So this is the hard work portion of it. And I can't emphasize more than anything, remove all the weeds, including the roots. You want to get at those roots and as best you can get them all out there. Do not use weed killers. You're going to be eating what it is you grow there. And in an age-old adage of saying, pay now or pay much more later. You don't want to leave those weeds, especially the first 4 to 6 weeks. I mention it later on. I think it's one of the big mistakes that new gardeners get into. They do the initial weeding, they may occasionally water, but they forget to weed, or they'll go away for 2 or 3 weeks and come back and the garden's in a total mess. You want to avoid any weeds going to seed, so pick them before they have seed heads on. And things like dandelions go to seed very early in the year. So our soil, for the most part, wherever I've been up in Fort Mac and certainly down here, there's a lot of clay soil. Clay soil is fortunately full of nutrients, so it's one good is good, but you do need to dig it over. You do need to break it up. My suggestion is to add as much compost to it as you possibly can. It will really help it. If you don't have compost, then certainly adding some peat moss is a help. It's not perfect, but it will help to break up the soil. There isn't a need to, I see a lot of people going to a lot of extreme to get a fine tilt soil. You don't need to do that. Be reasonable, be practical about how much you break it up. But if you're digging out soil for the first clay for the first time, you need to go at least a spade depth down and get as much, compost material as you can inside of that. So I've said amend with compost, and I'm only just going to do a quick highlight on compost. Compost is made up of basically 2 prime parts. So 2 elements, nitrogens and carbons that you're looking for. So you can throw anything. Don't throw things like meats that we would throw out in our recycles these days. You want to look at garden plants. A little bit of grass. Grass is terrible for breaking down. I know the main landfill in Edmonton these days, which was one of the industry leaders in recycling, won't take any grass anymore. And it's just so slow to break down. So don't load a compost up with grass. You want thin layers of it. Things like corn cobs, you can certainly put weeds in as long as they're not seeded. Tea leaves, coffee grinds, and then for carbon, shredded newspaper, a bit of wood ash, dry lint, and fall leaves. Excuse me. I often get asked about rhubarb leads. Oh, I do apologize. Adding rhubarb leads to compost, and they're perfectly okay to do so. There's a lot of oxalic acid in rhubarb leads. The picture of the compost on the left here on the screen, to me, is like an ideal size. You can buy lots of black barrels these days, and small composts don't particularly work well over our cold winters. So the bigger the compost size, so something like this, which is, they look like 3 or 4 feet by square, works very well. If you've got 2 bins, it also works well. So I'll give that some thought. Oh, excuse me. So when to plant? We'll start on the some of the dates here. So Okotoks, our frost-free days, according to the National Gardening Society Association, is the 10th of June to the 30th of August. It's not a long season. In many ways, it's not that much longer, if it is, than even up in Fort McMurray. Calgary's a little bit more fortunate, although the National Garden Association gives 1 set of dates for Calgary, which we end up with an extra 30 days. But I'm assuming that is greatly dependent on whereabouts in Calgary you live. So the May long weekend is often the traditional weekend to start planting. To me, it's a guide only. I would certainly plant some hardier seeds. They're protected, they're underground, so things like lettuce and spinach and carrots and beet seeds. I don't see any problem at all in planting those. But be very careful if you've bought some plants or grown some plants yourselves and you're planning out putting them out unprotected. It's certainly down here, the last few years, we've had frosts into early June very frequently here. So early June, it's a good time to plant seed potatoes. If you've planted them a little bit earlier and they're starting to grow and you get a frost, you will brown off the leaves. Don't worry too much about it. You can just cut those brown leaves off. If you can protect them if you wanted to put a cover over them. Mid-June is the earliest you really want to be planting peas and beans. Squash, definitely. If you've got squash plants, they don't like frost at all. Late June, early July, keep your eye on frosts. I hate to say it, but certainly in early June, you want to be protecting your plants at all cost.
All right, should we jump into some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Oh, you're saying cover plants if there's a frost. That's a good thing to do. All right, so we have one question from Tim. Where should a compost bin be placed in relation to sunlight in one's yard?
So ideally, the more sunlight and the more heat you can get into your compost, the better it is. And it will break down. So before I had my coughing fit earlier, and I do apologize, one of the reasons why you want the compost to be as wide and as tall as you can make it is you will actually retain heat in the center of the compost, and it will help to break it down even during the winter. The shorter it is, the narrower it is, then it'll dissipate its heat very rapidly. So if you've got a compost, if you can afford to put it in the sun, then please do. It's not going to hurt it. Just keep it a little bit moist, not wet, but moist. You do need some water in there. Turning it over, giving it a bit of air, moving it from one pile into the other is excellent idea.
And should anybody ever add worms to their compost?
You can certainly add garden worms to it. It'll help that year. I think the garden worms will just end up dying. You know, they're not the regular worms for vermiculture or whatever it's referred to as now. You know, that's a whole different topic in itself, and those worms recreated at an alarming rate. So I wouldn't normally add anything to my compost. Okay. So I thought I'd add a little bit about container gardening. I'm assuming there's people that may have a balcony and have some opportunities. And here's two good examples of container gardening. I actually do grow the odd zucchini in a container, but as you can see on the left, this is not mine. The zucchini is, you know, it's just a squash variety. It can take up an awful lot of room, so just be aware of that. The larger the container, the better it is. Small containers dry out fast. And when you've got containers, you end up spending a lot of time, you know, watering them. I have a greenhouse, and my tomato plants that I grow inside my greenhouse are basically in grow bags. And I water them every day of the summer, basically. You do need drainage holes. So something like these blue Lowe's bins in this row here, you're going to need 2 or 3, 4 quarter-inch holes. This white barrel here, I'd say you're going to need probably half a dozen. If you end up with, you may end up with a container with one large hole. It's probably too much. A real good cheap way of blocking out or partially stopping all the drainage is putting a coffee filter over that large drain hole. But 4 or 5 small drain holes is a much better idea. You do want that water to drain out. You don't want it to become stagnant and the roots of the plants just sitting in soggy water there, in soggy soil. If you're in a container gardening, I would suggest looking at things like bush, dwarf, and compact varieties. You'll even see some varieties of vegetables that are referred to as container varieties. I would also tend to choose early varieties, so those with the shortest days to maturity. If you're going to grow things like peas or tomatoes, and you can see all of the tomato, you know, these cages in these blue and orange cans, they're generally what's referred to as tomato cages, and they're perfectly fine for growing bush variety tomato plants. You want to be filling the containers with a quality potting mix that's soilless. There are some very good varieties around. You can certainly add some compost to those grow bags and containers. The two that I particularly like is ProMix. They do a BX and a HP variety, and I really like the BX that many stores sell these days. Sunshine makes a good product. I hate to say it, but there's a potting mix that Costco sells, and I've had very poor success with it. I don't like to, I know Costco do sell a lot of good products. It's one of the few products that I don't particularly like, and I think it's 99.9% peat moss. whereas these have other mixtures in them. The Pro Mix actually has a mycorrhiza bacteria in it that promotes root development. If you're in containers, you definitely need to be providing some weekly soluble fertilizers. Now, you may grow things in some of these containers, such as mint is a good example. Even things like strawberries, for instance, that are hardy enough to overwinter. They will not survive if you just leave them above ground in the container. The vast majority of them will die. You can take your containers inside a garage. If you've got a reasonably insulated garage, it might help. I grow a number of varieties of mint, and I just leave them in the container at the end of the year, dig a hole in my back garden and bury them, and bring them out in the springtime. And I'll be doing that in this next week or so. But just be careful if you're wanting to keep some of the varieties of plants that are hardies and are perennials year after year. Any questions? Sorry, before I...
Oh, it's all good. Yeah, I think we could probably get two in here if we want to. For the container gardening, should people put rocks in the bottom as well as the drainage holes to provide a little bit more drainage?
You don't need to at all.
Okay.
As I said, I've grown cucumbers and peppers and zucchini, tomatoes. I don't bother with any rocks at all and gravel. You are helping it, but these plants are pretty aggressive growers for the most part. And if you're monitoring on a regular basis, you're fine. And you know,
Okay.
to tell if a plant needs water, just put your finger in down to the first knuckle, and if it's dry, add water. If in doubt, leave it for another few hours and then add water.
Okay, and what about soluble fertilizer for container gardening? Is there a specific one you would want to use?
I would use 20-20-20. I think it's a really good catch-all, and I'll explain a little bit more later on. But I just don't think you can go wrong, especially for things like that are fast growers, things like zucchini, cucumbers. I wouldn't use it for peppers. If you're growing sweet peppers and hot peppers, I'd have to go and look up off the top of my head rather than give you the numbers. But if you put 20-20-20 into pepper plants, they will tend to be too leafy and too green, and they won't produce insufficient fruit. And that is the only vegetable that I'm aware of right now where I wouldn't really apply a 20-20-20 fertilizer. Okay. All right, let me get through some seeds and plants. So I thought I'd just provide here's an outlook of, should I put seeds in or should I put plants in? And for me, the reason to pick seeds is maybe it might be slightly cheaper to buy seeds, but I think the overriding thing is the choice of varieties that you have. You get to decide the variety. So if you're going to go and buy a plant, even in a greenhouse or a garden center, it's not very often that they'll give you the choice of carrots that you want or the choice of beets. And you can see these lovely beets on the right-hand side, that you can grow. It's very difficult getting those varieties in a garden center. You get to choose, especially not just the varieties, but the varieties with the right durations that meet our climate. And I'm always a big component of getting the earliest varieties that you possibly can. And this particular Renee's Gardens, it's an American company. It's one of the few American companies that I particularly like in seeds. because they'll give you a number of, they have a number of plants, tomatoes, beets, good examples where they'll give you 4 or 5 varieties in a packet, and each of the varieties are labeled. There's a company on the East Coast called Veggies that I buy seeds from. They'll give you mixed seeds, but when you're planting them, you have no idea which seeds you're planting. And so that's not, for me, that's not very helpful. I want to know exactly what seeds and varieties that I'm actually planting. So there are some vegetables that are certainly more troublesome to grow, and it's just easy to go and buy the plants. Tomatoes take a little bit of time to get started. Leeks are very difficult to find, and if you do find them at garden centre, I'm not so certain you'll get the right varieties. And parsnips and broccoli, it's just easier to go and buy them than start them yourself. I grow leeks and I grow parsnips and tomatoes, and all my seeds have been started at the beginning of February here. If you're picking up plants and seedlings from a garden centre, you do have to harden things off before final transplanting outside. You need to harden them off gradually, and it's not just at any colder weather. If it's blistering hot outside, the heat will damage the plants as well. So just be careful, slowly take them out and slowly get them accustomed to the either cold or the warmth that's outside and to the sun. And that usually takes about 3 to 5 days. Be careful buying plants. Check they are suitable for our shorter season, especially from box stores. I hope that most of the garden centers usually know what they're selling. Not so certain they all do, but in a box store, you're much less likely to get somebody who's knowledgeable about the plant they're selling. You want to select seeds with the shortest growing days. So for me, that's less than 70. If I'm buying lettuce seeds, it's probably less than 50 if I can. So you need to give that a lot of thought. That to me is the prime advantage of buying seeds. Select the ones. I mentioned, I'll give you a good example. I grow a lot of leeks, and I found a leek from West Coast Seeds called Chinook. It's about 69 days. Every other leek on the market is 100 plus almost. There's another one that's about 80 or something, but they're very difficult to find. And that's the advantage of buying seeds. Save your seeds for next year. Seeds will last for years in our climate. We've got a dry climate. It's not very humid at all. If you buy a packet of carrot seeds, there's easily 7 to 100 to 1,000 seeds in that packet. It would be unlikely that you would use one packet in a year. So just keep the seeds clean and reseal them and mark the packet what year it is. I've certainly got seeds that are 4 and 5 years old that I'm still using. Questions?
Yeah, we've got one from Robert. He's asking if you could comment on seed selection. For example, does greater cost equal a better quality of seed?
It's probably a good question. I like to think so, but I'm not so certain, Robert. My next slide, I mentioned a number of seed companies that I use, and I picked the popular ones. Maybe I don't know whether the quality of seed is any better. I think it's more like you may get varieties that you won't find somewhere else, and that's what you're paying for. And maybe some of the hybrid varieties that are being crossed are a bit more unique. Okay. So I know we've got a little ways to go here, so I'm going to go through some of these a bit more quickly. So these are some of the more popular seed companies. So in most of the garden centers down here in Calgary, you will certainly see West Coast seeds. You will certainly see Renee's garden seeds. I haven't seen any different in any of these that I've used. I've used West Coast, Renee's Garden. I ought to get them from almost every year. Veggies out of PEI, I get some certain tomato plants that I get. Earlies in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon is very good. William Dam has a very good online catalog. TNT Seeds I know is very popular with many of our garden club members from Manitoba, just outside of Winnipeg. In Alberta, there is some Wild Rose Heritage seeds that I've grown over the years. And I think one of the biggest seed companies in Canada is the Ontario Seed Company. So you certainly give that a look. And almost all of these catalogs, while it's great to enjoy them over the winter holidays and browsing through the catalogs, all of these companies have their orders, their catalogs online and very easy to look at. The box stores, almost all of the big box stores sell Mackenzie, Burpee, and Mr. Fotheringills, which I think is from the UK. So I give that a miss, but I've actually used all of these and not had any problems at all. The one thing I do get asked is about GMO seeds. Are all garden seeds GMO? And they are. It's actually illegal to sell GMO seeds to the general public here in Canada. So I can assure you that, and that's straight from the University of Saskatchewan, that I verified that with. There are no GMO seeds, garden vegetable seeds, available to regular gardeners like ourselves. They're only commercially available. You'll see an awful lot of the seed companies refer to all of their seeds being GMO. It is just a marketing ploy, and that's all. As you can see here, I just thought I'd mention very, very quickly, if you use some seeds, mark the year that you buy them in, just so that you've got some leftovers, you know how old they are. I like West Coast seeds. They'll actually give you a germination rate, so roughly how many of the seeds may germinate or may not germinate. Always look for the number of days here. This is celeriac is very long, so it's one of those seeds that I planted back in February. So just give that some thought. Is it possible to save seeds from hybrid tomatoes? So the tomato on the left, whenever you see F1, you know that that's a hybrid tomato. So 2 tomato plants have been crossbred manually. It's a physical application that's happened with the 2 plants, taking the properties of both plants. Yes, you can save those plants. Will it be true to the successful plants that you've just grown? It's likely not, and it is very common that what will happen is the seed will produce what will grow out as one of the parent stock. So I generally never keep seeds from any of my tomatoes. I buy fresh hybrid seeds each year. Questions?
Yeah, we've got one question from Carly. She's saying, talking about, funky things like purple carrots and golden beets, without shopping for seeds online, where would she be able to find some seeds like that?
If I wanted some seeds like that right now here in Calgary, I would go to Garden Retreat, which is just near Chinook Mall. I would go to Green Gate, which is on the south side of Calgary. There are a few garden centers. I would be looking for West Coast seeds. Spruce it up here in De Winton area is a good garden center. I would still think, I know Garden Retreat still has seeds in because our friends just emailed me tonight. They've still got plenty of seeds available there. And I've got a list of garden centers on my last slide. Okay, I'm going to move on because I know what the time is here. Should you sow all the seeds and plants at the same time? That was the question that got asked earlier on. I would stagger my seed sowings, certainly on those faster growing plants like the leafy greens. This is an example of square foot gardening that I talked about in a raised bed. So it's been divided out into square feet. You can certainly scatter them. And the whole intent of square foot gardening is clearly to, is to maximize your growth in a small space. You know, it seems obvious, but if you've got fine seeds, like I'm going to say carrots are reasonably fine seeds, it's easy to do a furrow, one straight line in a ditch and then just cover them over. And then thin out the seeds, thin out the plants as they grow. If you've got larger seeds like squash plants, it's a good example, zucchini, you can put them in a hill or plant them individually. Just remember that the only reason rows were ever designed was for commercial harvesting. You can plant them however you want to plant them in your gardens, and square foot gardening is a good example of that. The one disadvantage of scattering your seeds in a random manner rather than in a row is weed identification. And when new plants are coming up for the first time, then I do know people often get confused between what is the plant and what is a weed. And if you put that in a nice, steady, straight row, then it becomes much more obvious what is the plant versus what is the weed. And in my experience at the community gardens, I've had a lot of people come and ask me, is this a weed? And they just haven't known at all. If you're planting seeds and planting plants, water them in, give them some good watering, but don't flood them out there and have seeds floating away down the drain. And you've got to give some size to the fully grown size of the vegetable. And if I look at this one, it's a good example where at the back here, they look like they're growing cabbages or some such, and they look like they're almost growing just one plant into the square foot. Whereas down here where they're growing some carrots, so they're still applying, the directions that's on the back of the packets. And beyond these look like they're either leeks or scallions or that they're growing. Don't overcrowd the rows and allow room for access. If you are growing them in rows, you do need to get between plants at times and hoe up and weed out. Weed regularly. I can't emphasize that enough. In the first 4 to 6 weeks, it's pay now or pay later. You need to get out and keep that and stop it becoming overwhelming. Overseed and lay out a thin, carrots and beets especially, and turnips grow like wildfire. And there's a lot of seeds in a packet, so sprinkle them generously, and as they grow, and if they grow too close together, just thin them out. And then, as it gets into early August, you can start eating that vegetable as well, and as a young vegetable. Questions?
Yeah, Todd asked the question, are there vegetables you would start indoors, like germinating indoors, rather than direct seeding into your garden?
Yeah, I would. And it's the vegetables that I mentioned earlier, things like leeks, celeriac, parsnips, that take a long growing season. Our regular growing season here just is not long enough for almost any of those varieties. Even the tomato plants, I start off early to get a good start on things. Peppers is another one I'd start off if you like sweet peppers, especially hot and even hot peppers. They just a long maturity date on those vegetables.
That's great. And do you increase any speeding rate to compensate for the germination rate when you know what that germination rate is going to be?
No, not really. I'm not that scientific about it. I always seed. When I grow my plants indoors here, I grow far more plants than I ever need. And as Ginny knows, we have the Okotoks Garden Club normally has a plant share activity in May time. It's partly a fundraiser for the club, but actually money also goes to the local food bank. And so any spare excess plants I have, I tend to give away there as well. So I overproduce deliberately. Okay. All right. So I figured I'd end up getting asked what were my recommendations for beginner vegetable garden, and I'm going to try to move along a little bit here. So I've written down here some beets and lettuce. You can certainly throw in some spinach, carrots and peas and beans, Swiss chard. If you haven't tried it, it is just great thing to grow. Golden zucchini. Why grow ordinary zucchini? You can get some nice yellow ones. Turnips are very easy. Green onions and shallots. I'll talk a little bit more about potatoes and tomatoes. Maybe. I have a slide specifically on potatoes, so I will deal with that, as I thought it's very common. People like to grow them, but I'll explain why they're not in my recommendation, and it's the same as tomatoes. Mint and chives is so easy to grow them if they just thrive. And if you're going to grow a fruit, if you like the old-fashioned fruit of rhubarb, it is so easy to grow. It's probably a plant I've been growing for 40 years. There's a great variety called Canada Red. And raspberries, there are a ton of raspberries. I probably get more than 6 quarts of raspberries every summer. And I've been growing raspberries up in the north of Fort McMurray and down here very successfully. They are so easy to grow. I took this particular article, it's very quick, you can have a look at it. In 1 packet of seed from the Ontario Seed Company, you get 7 different vegetable plants of seeds. So beets, green beans, carrots, cucumber, lettuce, peas, and radish. But what I liked about this, it said these varieties can all be grown together quite nicely in a 10 by 10 garden plot. And as a bonus, you can still leave yourself enough room for extra seeding for a second crop. So certainly things like beets and the carrots and the lettuce and the radish, you can grow. Radish grows very quickly here. And I just wanted to give that some thought. It just shows you what can be planted in a 10 by 10 garden plot. Questions?
Yeah, Lynn is wondering what kinds of fruit can be grown other than rhubarb, raspberries, and Saskatoons for our area.
Yeah, I don't do a lot with fruit. There's lots of apple trees and pears. If you're going to look for fruit trees, the sour cherry, the Evans sour cherry is sort of famous in the province because I think almost all of the Evans sour cherries came from a patch that was just north of Edmonton that was saved many years ago. If you're looking for fruit trees, I'm going to tell you the best place to go down here is the Saskatoon farm. Paul, who runs the Saskatoon farm garden, has many of his own varieties of pears and apples. Let me think about that in terms of the fruit. Certainly, you can grow strawberries. Strawberries are just a little bit more work. these two are so darn easy, and that's why I've chosen them here. I will come back to that as well. Okay. Vegetables to think twice about. So I'm going to run through this really quickly because, you know, I'm targeting this as a beginner. Cabbage and cauliflowers, you can grow. They are very prone to pests and diseases and bolting. Bolting is when something goes to seed quickly, and it usually does it in the heat of the peak of our summer. So they rapidly go to seed, and they're not as good to eat. You can eat them, but they're just not as fresh. Celery, it's another one of those, to answer the question that was asked earlier, that if you want to grow celery, it's better if you start them a bit earlier inside, in March and April. You can usually find plants in a lot of the garden centers though, and that might be a good option to buy. Potatoes, they just need a lot of space, and there is a particular problem, so I'm going to leave this for now as I've got a slide on potatoes. Leeks, seed needs to be started in February. And if you're going to plant something around here, you need to look for, this is by far the best variety, Chinook. It's 65 days, and even that I still start my plants in and around February, but I can start eating them in mid-August. And there's another variety that I found, I'm not so certain where I found that. It's just not easy to find in a garden center. Sweet peppers, low yield for a lot of effort. And you've got to, as I said earlier, you've got to really look at what's the fertilizer that you're giving them. Don't give them 20-20-20. Hot peppers, they'll get a much greater yield out of them, but they still take a long growing season. And neither of these plants like our cool evenings that are down here. You need to give them some shelter. Parsnips need a deep, loamy soil. So fine soil, and the seed needs to be started very early. They require a long growing season, 110 days plus. Growing them in a soil such as clay, you will end up, they will grow at the very top heavy, lots of green, but the bulb part, which is what we eat, will look like an octopus. There'll be legs coming out all over the place. And what happens is the minute the root hits anything that's troubling to it, it will divert off. And I've grown a number of parsnips here, and I'm actually, if I hadn't knocked my seed tray over today of parsnips, I was planning on growing them and giving them a try in a grow bag for the first time. Tomatoes, you can grow them. If you're growing them in an open field, you need to pick a bush variety. So that's called a determinate. They just don't do well without protection, especially from our cool nights. In many ways, it's harder to grow tomatoes down here in the Calgary region than it is in Fort McMurray. The nights in Fort McMurray just don't cool off like they do here at our elevation and proximity to the mountains. They need regular watering, and they need fertilizing weekly. I do give a recommendation for a hanging basket variety that's much easier and much earlier. Corn, lots of space, low yield. You need an early variety. I just don't recommend them for a beginner. I know people like to grow corn, and don't even think about sweet potatoes. Questions?
Yep, we've got Tim asking, what type of shelter do you need to provide for peppers?
So ideally, you need a greenhouse. But I understand that everybody doesn't have a greenhouse. So if you wanted to grow peppers, I would grow them on the south side of a house or a fence, where you're getting some heat reflection from the property or the fence, and that should be sufficient. It doesn't have to be anything exotic. Yeah, it's better. You could certainly make a plastic polyethylene cover for them. It would help in our evenings. Our evenings do get cool. But if you can force them by putting them on a south-facing fence or part of your house, it would be ideal. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on. So here's some of the recommendations that I would make. Beets are so darn easy to grow. And you can find a Detroit dark red in any box store out there. The Merlins is another red one, is very successful. It's a West Coast Seeds. Boulder and Touchstone are golden ones. You can certainly find them in box stores. If you go to some of the garden centers that I have are listed at the back here, you will find them. They are prone to flea beetles in their early stages. You know, since I've gardened down here in Okotoks, I use row covers and I haven't had one problem with flea beetles. Growing marigolds next to them deters them. You can use pyrethrum and rotenone. Even though those are natural deterrents, I just don't like putting pesticides that are on vegetable plants. If you can get past the flea beetles, and they only bother the plant in the very early stages, so put a cover over them for the first few weeks, you'll find they're okay. And you can harvest them throughout the season. Carrots, because of our clay soils, I pick Chantenay and Danvers varieties. They tend to be shorter and stubbier. You can even grow some that are cylindrical, just like a beet. But I particularly like the Danvers and Chantenay varieties. Cabbage, I would suggest if you want to grow cabbage, buy plants. They are prone to bolting, cabbage worm, moths, root maggots. I don't grow cabbages. I gave up growing them a long time ago. I prefer to focus my energy somewhere else. There's always a lot of problems. You need to rotate them. Don't grow them in the same location every year. The best way to stop the insects on them is put floating row covers over them. And I'll talk a little bit more about floating row covers coming up. But they are very problematic with getting cabbage worm and moths and root maggots. Lettuces, as I said, grow so small amounts of seeds over 6 weeks. There are hundreds of varieties. Pick the type that you like. I always give something a try. I mentioned this tamarindo, never grown it before. I got some started here. I'm going to see what it's like. That's the fun of growing from seed. Spinach and arugula does tend to bolt quite quickly in our hot summers. So even lettuce, growing in partial shade is a good idea. It'll grow slightly more slow, but it won't tend to bolt. And look for, especially when you're picking spinach, that you'll often see bolt-resistant varieties. Select them if you can. And by the way, when you're picking lettuce, you don't need to pick the whole thing out. Just trim a few leaves off at a time. You can use a pair of scissors or pull a few leaves off. You don't need to remove the entire plant. Likewise with peas, there are tons of peas and beans out there. The traditional English peas, snow peas, sugar snaps. Again, I just picked a couple of varieties that are early. You do need to stake and support them, as I said earlier. Same with the beans. Pick tons of different bean varieties out there, whether it's French beans or runner beans or broad beans. Tons of different colors and stripes and freckled, different pole varieties. Whatever you would like. Swiss chard. So I've been growing Swiss chard now since I came down to Okotoks. I hadn't grown it previously. It's very high in nutritional value, as you can see there. It is so easy to grow. And it's one of those plants that doesn't like good soil. So don't worry too much about it. It just prefers a poor soil. You'll see bright lights is very common, and you'll find those seeds all over the place. Just plant the seeds direct and you'll have tons of Swiss chard. You can eat the leaves as in a salad, and you can certainly eat all of the stalks as well, however you wish. Turnips, both varieties, purple white tops and rutabagas, grow very prolifically here, I found. Just think about how many turnips you want to eat. I ended up giving many away to the local food bank, and they enjoyed those. Questions?
Let's just move on to the next thing, and then we can do a whole bunch at the end.
Okay, great. I'll keep moving here as quickly as I can. So some other easy vegetables, and I'll try to get through these really quickly. Squash. If you're going to pick squash, certainly don't plant outside until there's no sign of frost out there. A really easy variety is one called a patty pan. The variety is scallopini, but patty pan squash do exceedingly well down here, and they're not big or huge. They're just a really good size, and they keep exceedingly well. Zucchini, I'm a big lover of the golden varieties. One of the reasons, if you go the green ones, if you don't pick them just right the next day, they seem to be enormous, and you can be eating zucchini all summer long in every shape or form, but they do take up a bit of room. Herbs, certainly chives are very easy. You can grow garlic chives. Basil, I grow a lot of basil. I tend to grow it in the greenhouse, and I give them away to friends that I know grow them outside. They just don't like overwatering. Ideal for container gardening. There's just so many good varieties out there. Mint, I grow a number of different varieties, spearmint, peppermint, apple, and ginger. Are very easy to grow. Do not just put it straight into your garden. Mint grows at an enormous rate, grows wild. It is very invasive. Put it in a container and bury the container over winter. It is just, I can't emphasize that enough. And there's lots of other herbs to consider. I'm just picking some basic varieties. Onions and shallots, they're just so much easier to grow from plants and bulbs that you can buy in a box store or a garden center. It's so much easier. So my tomato plants, if you're going to grow and you want to grow tomato plants, as a beginner gardener, Tumbler or Tumbling Tom are really good hanging baskets varieties. There's cherry tomatoes. I grow one of those varieties every year in a couple of baskets, and you will be inundated with cherry tomatoes from 2 plants. Good bush varieties that need very little trouble other than a bit of water and a bit of fertilizer is Mamma Mia and any Roma variety. They're very good. There is a new variety out called Sunrise Sauce, which is a yellowy orange Roma tomato. It is also exceedingly good. The bush varieties, so determinates, are much easier to grow in an open field, although I still think tomatoes need a little bit of a shelter on a south wall or a fence if you can. They just need watering regularly. If you don't water tomatoes regularly, so every other day, they do tend to end up with blossom end rot. So the bottom of the tomato fruit will go dark and black, and it will spoil the fruit. It's also partially due to calcium deficiencies, but mainly watering is a problem. Raspberries and rhubarbs, I've mentioned a couple of varieties. They're just so easy to grow. Raspberries just need to be dead caned and cut out every springtime. A little bit of shelter from wind really helps them. You can put them in a corner of your garden, behind a fence or something, really helps. And the same with rhubarb. You just need to divide rhubarb. It's a perennial, so you need to divide it every 3 to 5 years, like most perennials. I haven't got into, there's a whole bunch of other vegetables out there, squash and cabbages and cauliflowers and broccoli. You can grow them, they just take a lot more work, or a bit more work and effort. Questions?
It's all right, Colin. Why don't you just continue?
Okay, I will. So here's my potato. And this is why I don't recommend you growing potato in the ground. Potato scab is prevalent throughout Alberta, but certainly seems to be Edmonton and south thereof. This is what a potato scab looks like. I've grown potatoes down here for 5 years. I have not avoided it. The problem is once it's in the ground, it can take decades to get rid of. You need an acidic soil, so you need to add lots of peat moss and spruce needles. I have tried using pounds and pounds of coffee grinds that you can get free from places like Starbucks, but it's not acidic enough. You really need some, a soil that's acidic that prevents the bacteria from forming. Crop rotation is essential. If you're putting potatoes in the same place every year down here, you're going to have a problem eventually. And once you get it, it could take you more than 10 years to get rid of it easily. A way of avoiding it is eating early and new varieties. Potatoes generally come in early, medium, and late varieties. The longer the potato tuber is in the soil, the more likely it's going to be attacked by the bacteria. The good news, as I said at the top, and I've just overlooked, sorry, it is superficial. So you can peel a potato and the potato underneath is perfectly okay. It is not the same as potato blight, which is a big problem in the UK, in England. There are some, fortunately, there are some scab-resistant varieties out there. I've grown French fingerlings, and to me, they're probably the best potato I've ever grown. I know Spruce It Up often sells them, and Greengate sell them. Norlands I've grown for decades. They're a very early potato. In fact, this potato here looks like a Norland to me, although you won't see scab like that on it. Viking is another red-skinned potato. Gold Rush is a russet Burbank variety. So if you like russet Burbanks, I don't particularly like them myself, so I don't grow those. Yukon Golds and Red Pontiacs are very prone, unfortunately, to potato scab, so you really want to stay away from them. So I'll go over this quickly for those that haven't grown potatoes before. You want to dig a deep furrow, at least one spade depth, and let me show you this picture on the right. I would say it's actually not quite deep enough there, how I was taught to grow potatoes in the UK, but this is fine. You can certainly, as the potato starts to grow, you want to be able to hill them up, and you can use grow bags. So if you're using grow bags and you're using a lot of compost and a potting soil mix, you shouldn't have any problems with potato scab at all. And I'm actually going to try a couple of tubers in a grow bag this year. So I've shown you what a seed potato on the left looks like. That's how you'll buy them, from a garden center. That particular one, I would personally cut that at least in half and plant it. And that's perfectly okay to do. Just take a knife and slice it in half. And you want to have 2 of those sprouting eyes on each of the tubers. And that would be ideal. So if you harvest your potatoes as new potatoes, there's much less likely to get potato scab at that time. As it says here, if you haven't grown them before, as soon as the plant flowers, you can eat the potato. If you want to leave it for a main crop, you want to make sure that all of the top of the potato has died down. And you'll see it withers back and dies pretty quickly. But if you're eating as new potatoes and you still want to leave some as a main crop, just dig away some of the soil, take 1 or 2 potatoes, cover it back up, and from each plant, and that plant will continue growing. Any questions specifically on potatoes?
Yeah, actually, we received one from Len earlier this week via email, and he was saying that last summer he was growing potatoes and they looked really good, but he found that they were all tops and there weren't actually very many potatoes underneath. So he's wondering what went on there.
Oh, so I think occasionally that might happen. I'm trying to think if it's not watering, or they're not getting enough fertilizer, um, or the soils, is it too hard? I did, what came across last year was for the first time, and I know a few gardeners that happened to last year, was the potatoes cracked, and that was a lack of watering. But um, I'm sort of tempted to just wonder if you're either not getting enough sun or you haven't put the seed potato down far enough. It just seems rather odd. So as the potatoes grows, you should be hilling it up until the top of the green leaves constantly. And the more soil if it's loose soil, then the potatoes got lots of room to grow. So I can only think about compact, soil would be detrimental. Anything else?
No, that's all for now.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about maintenance. So you need to be out there watering regularly. And the best way to water is 1 deep watering a week. So give it a really good soaking as the plants start to grow. In our very hot weather, hey, you'll need to, use some judgment and water a second time if necessary, every, 2 to 3 days if it's blistering hot. Container watering, you need to be checking on those containers daily, because I'm telling you, they'll dry out quicker than you can believe. And that is the challenge with container gardening, especially if it's in direct sun. As you're out there, you need to weed weekly, especially those first 4 to 6 weeks. Don't procrastinate or it can become overwhelming. As you're out there weeding and watering, check your plants for any pests. As there looks something strange underneath a leaf or on a leaf, you want to get rid of them. And just manually do it for the best part. It's by far the best, unless it becomes overwhelming. Thin out the rows as you're growing carrots and beets and turnips. Thin them out, and they might be small, but you can certainly start eating them. Think about how big that plant is going to grow, and if they're too close together, you'll need to start thinning them out. And then fertilizing. So we've asked a little bit about fertilizing. So please don't use fresh manure. I know there's a big tendency, especially when there's a lot of farms around, you don't want to be using fresh manure. There is an E. coli risk. If you're determined to use fresh manure, you want to apply it in the fall. You want to be giving it a huge time to break down, a long time to break down, and many months before you harvest that vegetable. So for root vegetables, there needs to be at least 4 months. And for other crops that you're growing, like lettuce and that, it needs to be at least 3 months after you've applied fresh manure. The other problem with fresh manure, especially with horse manure, it is a prime source of weed in your garden. The seeds just seem to go through especially horses, and you will be inundated with managing weeds in your crops for a long time. And I can speak from experience at the local community garden. Compost is best. And if you add compost, you likely don't need to do anything else. When you're looking at those 3 numbers on a fertilizer that you're buying, it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And ultimately, that's what they're looking after. Nitrogen is best for leaves and overall growth. Phosphorus for roots and flowers and fruits. And that's where I was getting back to the peppers. You want a lower nitrogen number, a higher middle number. And then K is overall health and disease resistance. There's a lot more to it than that. I'm going over this relatively quickly. Granular fertilizer, you don't rarely get a 10-10-10, but numbers in that region, they're usually around about 7, 10, and 8 or something, if I remember right. Tomatoes are definitely heavy feeders. And you want to be feeding them very regularly. Questions?
Sure, we've got one quick one. Does mushroom compost work just as well as any other compost?
Sure. I wouldn't use it all on its own. I would mix it in with other compost because it lacks certain nutrients. All right, a few gardening tips. So marigolds are a very common companion planting. So anything you can do where you're adding a plant that's going to encourage other plants to grow or avoid or deter pests is a great way to garden. So in all the years I've grown tomato plants up in Fort McMurray, I always grew marigolds at the base of them for decades. And for me, they were actually a sacrificial, as much as anything, of them keeping any pests, and I never got anything on my tomato plants. The only things I ever saw was the marigolds always attracted slugs. So you can use them as a sacrificial one, and the photograph in the bottom left shows you next to tomato plants there. Mint is a good repellent for slugs, so think about your placement of that. If you're going to put mint directly in the ground, contain it somehow, because their roots will go everywhere. Celery and onions, and there's many other herbs, keep pests away. Radish is often used as a trap crop for insects and aphids, so it will attract them, and then you can go and just pick them off or remove the radish plant as that you want. And I've also, since coming down here, was told it's also used as a sacrificial crop for moles and voles. So often a lot of people will actually put them around their garden plot where there is mole and vole problems and use them to attract the voles there and not go after their beet plants or carrots. Use a cold frame. So the picture on the right is a good example of a very cheap cold frame. I start and usually my lettuces are looked after in cold frames, same as spinach and arugula. It's a quick way of really pushing a plant and forcing a plant to maturity quickly and giving them some protection against frost. Vegetables tolerant frosts. So root vegetables are generally very good and very tolerant. I've certainly dug carrots up when the ground's been almost frozen. In fact, parsnips, the sugars won't form after the first frosts, and they're a much better vegetable if you can wait. So give that some thought. Keep a journal of what you did, what varieties you planted and when you varieties, and if there was something unique happened, that's summer. It really helps you to remember how well or how disappointing a particular variety was. Yearly crop rotation. This is not always easy to do on a small property in an urban house. But if you can not plant the same vegetables in the same locations, things like potatoes really benefit from where peas and beans will grow in the year before. And I don't think I mentioned, if you're growing peas or beans, after you've pulled the crop, just dig them straight into the ground. They will disintegrate compost very quickly. Questions?
It's okay, you can continue on.
Okay, good. So, a couple of tips. I am a big proponent of floating covers. They are amazing for keeping bugs out. They don't look like very much. It looks like thin cloth. But they call floating row covers a horticultural fleece. They often have a temperature rating. I don't go for the best temperature rating. I go for the middle one, as some of them are a bit costly. But they are great. They prevent moisture evaporating from the soil as quickly, and the ground baking hard. They prevent access to a lot of pests and insects. They give you some frost protection, and that's the temperature rating on them. They even provide some heat protection and prevents plants underneath from bolting and burning. And even wind and hail. Even with all the hail that we get down here, I've never had any of my plants severely damaged. And I grow all my leeks under this. I grow all my beets as well. I usually get them started that way. And I find they're working exceedingly well. This photo in the middle and the one on the right is my gardens up at the community garden. And I think the one on the left is a public domain photograph from Sydney, Australia, that I found where they're using them. An awful lot of commercial gardeners these days are using horticultural fleece. And I also have to tell you that I had to put this in here because this is my wife's idea, and it was one of the best ideas that we've really had. It's made a lot of success to my gardening. First frost. So don't think that we might not get a frost at the end of August or early September. Look out for it then. You don't want to be ruining all your hard work. A good old tip is, if you know there's a light frost coming, water your plants in the night before, just before the frost. Cover them with a blanket or a tarp, just temporarily. It'll really help. Add some mulch. If you've got onions growing out of the ground and the bulb is out there, just cover them with some mulch or some compost, grass clippings, newspaper, anything like that. And just be imaginative, just to protect them. Right. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. These are the big mistakes that I've seen. Not harvesting when ready. If you're growing peas and lettuce, you want to pick it when it's fresh. The picture on the left is a good example of the lettuce going and bolting. It's gone to seed and it won't taste particularly great. If you know it's happening, nip it off at the head before it seeds. Planting everything at once. I've seen everybody plant corn and peas and beans and lettuce and all these neat rows, not thinking about when these plants are actually going to produce. You've got to think about the work at the end of the season as well in harvesting. Weeds, don't delay. Keep an eye on the weeds. I can't overemphasize that. Planting an incorrect variety, you've got 120 days and you've got, a 90-day season. It's just not going to work. Growing tomatoes without shelter. They will grow. I will tell you, you will get, tomatoes will grow in an open field, like on the right-hand side in these cages. They definitely will. They will produce so much more if you give them a little bit of shelter. That's the issue for them. And you will get them ripening on the vine, which is what you're looking for. I'm going to keep going. A couple of quick reminders. It's not difficult growing plants. They just need water, fertilizer, and sun, and a bit of attention to weeds. Experiment, try something new each year. But don't try everything all at once if you can help it. Visit local gardeners. Go and talk to them. Find out what they know about this. When I first came down here, I talked to local community gardens, and the first thing the guy told me was, don't grow potatoes because of the scab. I didn't listen, but he was right. Don't get discouraged. Some things work out and others might not. Some seasons are better or worse than others, but the one thing you can count on here is hail. And there's my rhubarb to show you. And you know, hey, I can use it. We used it. It didn't go to waste, but it was terrible. Most of all, you know, have some fun. Enjoy the fruits. What other, you know, activity do you get to than to eat the vegetables at the end of the season here? And there's one of my favorite persons in the world with one of my favorite vegetables, a leek. I'm going to go on to some references here very quickly because I know we're really out of time. If you want to learn more, please join the Okotoks Garden Club. It's a little plug. You can certainly find it on Facebook and I can give you some information. I would have said if you wanted some cheap plants, there's a plant swapping sale that we have every year that goes big donations to the Okotoks Food Bank. Obviously, because of the situation this year, it's cancelled. If you want to have some good books, I am a lover of Lois Hall's gardening books. They are cheap, they are practical, they are a good guide. They're a bit old these days. But I can't say enough about Lois Hall and how it, you know, her books, it really improved my gardening skills. There's certainly some other good books around here, especially for gardening in the Chinook country. So please take a look at those. The local garden centers. We have an abundance of garden centers here in the foothills and Calgary region. I've mentioned Garden Retreat. It's a shop just on the east side of Chinook Mall that I really like. I like the Saskatoon farm, especially if you've got fruit trees that you're looking for. Beaver Dam, I really like because I think they're very good value. And I think most gardeners are thrifty people. Spruce It Up and Countryside and Country Living are all good. And I do a lot of gardening at Greengate, but not so much for vegetables, but for some of my other plants. So, final questions. I do apologize for taking a bit longer than expected.
That's all right. We didn't lose too many people. We're good. We got 42 people still here listening. So I'm going to answer or ask a few questions here on behalf of, we'll start with Vivian. So she's asking, I've got a few container questions here. So can she use potting soil in a raised bed? And what are the best veggies to grow in a raised bed?
Oh,
so we might have covered some of that. So
yeah, you can grow anything you want in a raised bed. You could even grow potatoes if it's deep enough. Certainly lettuce, beets, carrots. Obviously, you want to be growing that, you know, something that's if the bed is bigger than 6 inches, definitely you can grow almost anything. And these are some, you know, the pictures in front of me are good examples there. You know, there's strawberries on the right growing. There's onions growing. There's nothing you can't grow in a container.
So what kind of soil would be the best to put in there?
So do a mix, do regular garden soil if you have, mix it with some compost or a bit of, you know, if you don't have any compost, some peat moss. Just don't make it too acidic with, you know, too much peat moss in there. But if you make a good balance of, you know, garden soil that you have with some peat moss in there, that would be more than fine.
That is a good answer. So how many seeds or plants should you be planting in each pot when you're container gardening?
So how big is the pot and what are the plants that are growing in there? So if you've got the pictures that I had on the container gardening where they were using the Lowe's buckets, you know, one tomato plant per, you know, per container. I just started a small 4-inch container that's got about 3 lettuce seeds or 4 lettuce seeds in it. It's a relatively small container, that I'm growing, it really looks at you really need to look at the plant. So you'll get away with a number of lettuces, provided they're not too big and they're baby lettuces. But it's a very difficult question. You really need to look at, look at the zucchini plant that was in the picture. One zucchini plant took a whole Rubbermaid bucket there, that it looked like.
All right, so where would be the best place to find good soil in our area?
I honestly don't know where I look for soil. I do know that if you don't have any compost, I know that there is a composting outfit at Alderside that does deliver. It's a really good question. I honestly don't know, because I've never ever had to buy soil. I've always taken the soil on my property, and I always had a compost heap going, and I always had compost.
Well, then I'm going to jump in, Colin.
Sure.
I know there are a few places around town. Dirt Cheap does sell dirt, a tri soil mix. And I believe there's a place on Alderside that I've heard has really good compost. Forgive me, I don't remember what their name is, but there can't be too many out in Alderside. So let's jump to another question then. We have somebody asking here, do you leave the floating covers on all day, every day, all season long?
Absolutely. So I put them on in the springtime, and the ones that are supported with a hoop, I actually leave them on all year long. There's no reason not to. As I said earlier, there's beneficial with frost protection at the beginning of the year. There's benefit of sun protection during the heat. And all I do the rain will go through it and wet the soil. But when I go up to water my garden, I just remove the ends and lift up the end covers, and I'll just use a hose to spray water, make sure it's getting into the middle of the plants. But absolutely, you can leave the floating row covers on all year round. The only plant to be careful of are things like squash and zucchini plants, and they need pollinators to develop that fruit. So they're essential. So you can put them over them once the fruit has started to form on them. But generally, things like zucchini and squash, I wouldn't put them on.
Okay, that's good to know. Todd is asking, what's the best wood material to use for garden boxes?
Oh, well, I wouldn't generally use anything that's pressure treated. I would tend to use something like a cedar. It's a little bit more expensive, but can you use some spruce? Absolutely. It's probably a bit cheaper, but if you wanted it to last a bit longer, I would tend to use cedar.
Okay. I guess we can take a few more questions
Yeah,
here.
absolutely.
People seem to be sticking around. You're giving them good information. So do you have any tips on storing root vegetables so that you can enjoy your veggies after the harvest?
No. So that is what it is, a topic unto itself. And the one thing that I would say, just be careful at the end of the year. If you've got 100 pounds of potatoes, you want to protect them. And so, I've got some hits and I've got some definite misses. So with my leeks, which is probably one of my pride and joys that I grow over 60 leeks every year. I've got a way that I can easily manage them, and I'll use them as many as I can fresh, but I'll slice them up and I clean them, and I'll actually put them in the freezer, a lot of them at the end of the year. It's very easy to do in appropriate use bags. But things like root crops, you need to keep them somewhere cool. They don't like being frozen. And that's the challenge. So I've seen people put them in coolers in the garage and on shelves in cupboards in the garage, but in a cooler so that they don't freeze, and they've insulated the cupboards. I just haven't found anything successful. And I'll be honest, I've wasted some veggies over the years since coming down here, and it annoys the anything out of me. Things like beets will, I was eating beets in January that I just kept in my fridge from September. If you can keep them at the right temperature, they will keep indefinitely. They're very good storers. I just don't have any really good tips for you. They just don't like being frozen.
Oh, and you know what? I have some good news for everybody on that account. In July, we're actually bringing in someone to talk about how to preserve your harvest. So Lori Neufeld's going to come and talk to us in July about canning and different other things that we can do. So we can all learn from each other. Brian Fay is asking, are there any risks with using deer manure? We've got a lot of that, all of us, on our front lawns, our backyards. Can we use it in our gardens?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just use the same advice. I don't think there are, other than what I'd mentioned earlier. So if I was using deer manure, I would apply it to my garden in the fall of the year. I would not want to risk putting it in too early prior to my eating the vegetables. So I think if I used that rule of thumb, which said 4 months for root vegetables, I would say, go ahead, store it, put it in your compost, and then apply it in the garden in the fall.
All right, let's do one by Sylvia. Do you recommend growing cucumbers in our climate?
Sure, you can grow cucumbers. If I look back at, and I'll quickly do it, if I can it's probably too long me doing it this way, but on that Ontario seed, go forward here, my apologies. On the Ontario seed one where I showed you in the 10 by 10 square foot, they grew cucumbers. So you can grow field cucumbers very nicely. I grow them, but I grow it inside a greenhouse again, and I only grow a couple of plants because they produced a lot of cucumbers. But you can grow them in the field. There's a lot of different varieties. My recommendation would be pick a variety that's got a short and early duration on them. You also want to, maybe if it's outside, it might not be a problem, but pollination of cucumbers can be problematic at times if they're not outside. But there are also varieties of cucumbers that are self-pollinating. They actually don't need to be pollinated. So just look at the varieties, but you can certainly grow cucumbers, absolutely.
All right, and we'll do one last question. This one's from Adrian. So how does one maintain strawberries to sustain the crop, since they all seem to have all the runners that they use a lot of energy to grow? So how can we get more berries, less runners?
So if you find the answer, you can tell me. So I've stopped growing strawberries because I'm sorry, I wish I had an answer. I think that you put a strawberry plant in, you seem to get an exceedingly good crop the first year, maybe the second year, but you have to start replacing those plants, it seems. Or I think you may need to chop off the runners and make sure that they're individual plants. It's one reason I think they're much more difficult to grow, and I didn't include them in this presentation today, because if I was going to give somebody a fruit recommendation, it would be raspberries, because I think they're 10 times easier to grow and the crop is 10 times more.
All right. Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I'm just apologizing. I wish I had a better answer.
No, that's all right. All right, so this will end our webinar. So I just want to say thanks, Colin. That was great, and thanks for answering all those questions. So to everyone who's here, thank you for joining us and thanks for being on our webinar today. Again, if you win the door prize, I'll contact you tomorrow via email and I'll arrange a safe drop-off option for you. We will also do our best over the next week or so to answer any questions that we weren't able to get to today on the webinar. Also, a recording of this presentation and a PDF of the PowerPoint slides will be available in the next few days, and I'll be posting that on the town website, so keep your eye out. I'll try and also send an email to let you all know where that will be posted. And I also mentioned our harvesting workshop that we've got going on in July. We're trying to have a webinar every month for a green Living Workshop series, so I hope you guys will join us. And also just happy Earth Day to everyone. Good luck with growing your veggies this year. And thank you again, Colin, and good night.
Thanks very much, Ginny. Thank you.
Thank you.